The gentleman there.
Yeah, I just wanted to react to the film. I found it a very compelling film, and it's impossible not to sympathize with the plight of the Palestinians. But I have to say, one striking thing about the film is there were Jewish voices in the film too. There was a rabbi, there was Jeff Halper from the House Committee Against House Demolitions. There were several Jewish voices in it. It seems to me that there's a bit of infantilization of Palestinians when there's no attempt to hold Palestinians responsible for their own political choices. And I know that their position is very different from the Israelis. It's a very difficult thing. But there was reference to the corruption of the PLO, their leadership of the PLO. There was no reference to Hamas and their rule in Gaza, which is, anything but nice. And it's occurred to me that one of the Jewish voices made the point that I think it was Chomsky that most of the Israeli public are not big supporters of the settlers. How do we explain this movement to the right in Israel? And to some degree, it's a reaction to the Palestinian, the situation among Palestinians. The Hamas, and to some degree Fatah, almost encouraged a death cult among Palestinian youth with suicide bombing. I think to some degree, and the film didn't reflect this at all, that the extremes in this conflict feed on each other, and that.
What's the question? This is a little long.
Okay, my question is: don't you think that it's wrong to leave the Palestinians in this conflict, even though they're the weaker party, to leave them completely blameless in what's going on? I think they share some of the responsibility for what's going on. That's my question.
Well, if you want me to attempt a response,
okay.
I'm not God Almighty, so my responses are far from being definitive. But my own after responses, first of all, I remember year after year when George W. Bush refused to deal with Arafat. He said, we don't have a partner in our negotiations, and Arafat obviously represented the PLO. And I also remember that Hamas actually, if we think back far enough, like 15 years earlier than that, was cultivated by the Israeli state. And the reason it did so is that it assumed wrongly, in the long run, that cultivating a religious organization would undercut the power of the Palestinian national movement. And so Hamas was actually privileged in the same way, in a kind of way that the CIA privileged the jihadist movements in, and I'm not saying that Hamas is a jihadist movement. It isn't, as far as I know. It's very different from Al-Qaeda. But this is a case of blowback, that Israel thought that that by cultivating a relationship with Hamas, that it would break the PLO. But unfortunately, Israel's response to the Intifada, to the civil rights protests, which were unarmed, was so brutal and intransigent that it radicalized everybody, including Hamas. And so do I deplore the killing of civilians? Of course I do, wherever that happens. But I don't make the mistake of confusing the causes of the conflict with its consequences. And that's a big difference, actually.
Sad.
Anybody? Somebody else? Please, yeah.
You mentioned sanctions. I was wondering who would best lead the way for sanctions against some of these operations here in Canada that are working with Israel.
Right.
Would we rely on our government? Would we rely on movements? Who's best suited to do that?
I think at various levels. Our experience in the South Africa sanctions and boycott and divestment was we have to start as a grassroots organization, because the very call for sanctions, the very call for boycott, even if it appears unrealistic at a given time, still plays a very important educational role. The very fact that we are raising the question of why are we trading with this. For many people who meet us in the street picketing chapters in Indigo, for reasons, if you want, I can explain later, they want to know, what are you doing here? I mean, what has chapters in Indigo ever done to you or me? And we explain its role to the Israeli military. Even if we can't bring them to their knees, we're playing an important role in educating people. But let me give you an example. I've got a lot of contacts in Scotland right now and in Ireland. And in Scotland, there is an Israeli company called Eden Springs, which manufactures and distributes water coolers. And over the last 16 months, the Eastern Scottish division of Eden Springs has had to close down because the Palestine solidarity committees have been so effective up there that they have completely collapsed the market. So there are no factories or warehouses in Edinburgh now. That's part of the Eastern Scottish division. I give you another example, but it's not from this conflict. It's and I was a bit involved on the margins of the Talisman Energy Corporation, which is a Canadian licensed in Alberta, as I remember, which used to do business in the southern Sudan. But because of the local pressures that were brought to bear, Sudanese comrades and other comrades from the Saharan region converged on annual general meetings of distributed education material to the media. And it was such an embarrassment to the Talisman Corporation that they finally divested and they got out of southern Sudan. That was a very successful targeted action against a particular company. So in answer to your question, I think it's a multi-faceted kind of struggle that we organize on a grassroots level, at the level of boycott, and we also organize within our organizations. Like in my organization, I'm having a hard time, but I am trying to raise the question of an academic boycott, with which my university would stop us from entering into collaborations and partnerships with Israeli colleges and universities. But also I would like to see us go beyond that and reach out to Palestinians and create scholarships and student exchange programs, collaborations and partnerships with Palestinian universities in the occupied territories. So I think it's a multi-strategy. I use grassroots, building up support, interconnecting with other parts of the country, and then going through your trade unions, your universities, your other work organizations, trying to raise consciousness in such a way. Hi.
That movement to boycott the Israeli defense missions, that wouldn't be the same movement that was covered in a National Post article on, I believe, last Monday, would it? I know there was a pretty big thing about, in the National Post, there was an article, and it basically had 10 paragraphs of Israeli groups, the Shin Bet and a few other people, calling whoever the student union groups who were trying to boycott Israeli defense contractors and academics who worked with them anti-Semites. And I was just wondering if that was related to that article, because I'd already written an editorial complaining that they didn't even bother to ask anyone in favor of it.
I don't know. I'm afraid I didn't read that. It's a good question. I'm not sure about that. I think there is an important point to your question as well, which is, I mean, I've often had it said to me, to be very blunt with you, why are you focusing on Israel? I didn't see you get any organizations out for Darfur. Don't you care about the people of Darfur? Or what about the Congo? Or other trouble spots? Why are you spending so much time dealing with the Israel conflict and not any of these other? Were you out on the streets protesting the Chinese invasion of Tibet and so on and so forth? And it quickly can become a kind of a corollary argument. The reason you're focusing on the Jewish state is because you are anti-Semitic. So I've thought about this myself, and I mean, I've also remembered that I've been called a white racist, actually, for criticizing, in some circles, for criticizing Robert Mugabe. Some people didn't like me doing that. I've been called a knee-jerk anti-American for protesting the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been called a traitor for not supporting the Canadian mission in Afghanistan. So it's an ad hominem argument. The reason that Israel is important to the anti-apartheid movement is firstly because we have a very close military and trading relationship, is what I was talking about earlier. We don't have a relationship like that with Sudan or with Iran. Now, there are already sanctions against Iran, There are sanctions against other countries. There's been sanctions against Cuba since the revolution. But Israel seems to escape sanctions. Even after what happened in Gaza, I didn't hear Hillary Clinton talking about the possibility of war crimes. And we know that the Israeli government will not allow the International Criminal Court representatives to go into the occupied areas. And unless they go in, we will never be able to certify anything that happened in Gaza as a war crime. So there isn't a war crime. It's airbrushed away, which to me is immoral, which to me is the same kind of immorality that happened in the Second World War when people did not want to know the Holocaust was happening. I mean, if we take the Holocaust seriously, as we do, as I do, the lesson of the Holocaust is don't let it happen again. Don't turn our backs. Don't pretend we can't see, particularly with this media, which is tranquilizing us, which I don't know if we can get Al Jazeera in Canada. I don't think so. But if we could watch Al Jazeera, the kind of exposure we would have got to Gaza would have been very different from what we got for the BBC.
You can get it online.
You can get it online.
On a Canadian.
That shows you how out of date I am. Sorry. So yeah, that's the argument. Sorry.
I'd like to make one or two comments, please, and then I do have a question. The first comment I'd like to make is you mentioned Venezuela. Recently there was an assault by a number of gunmen in a synagogue in Venezuela where they attacked the people and destroyed holy books. So Venezuela, I think we know where they're coming from. I'm going to label them by prerogative as an anti-Semitic country, irrespective of some of the issues you mentioned with Israel. Now the other thing is, quite often there's this mention of boycott. Boycott the academics, boycott products. Now you might think this is tripe, but this is factual. Anybody here who has a cell phone, hand it in, because the cell phone technology was developed in Israel through Microsoft. The same goes for computer software. The same goes for, unfortunately, my heart goes out if anybody knows of people who are going through cancer treatment. A lot of cancer drugs are developed in Israel. And there's that little microscopic camera.
What's it have to do with anything? They will brag about that till their faces turn blue.
Well, you're saying boycotting Israel.
Moderate.
You're saying boycotting Israel products, and that's what I'm telling you.
One of the
You're going to
ranting
have
last night
to.
at the other event.
I'm going to have to say that you're going to have to boycott.
Let her talk, but
Yes.
she was going to make two comments.
And then my other comment was about the microscopic little camera. My comment is when this video started, there was Northern Ireland under siege and conflict, and now we know there is some kind of cooperation and peace within Northern Ireland. They showed the blacks. We now in America have a black president. My basic question is, do you think there will ever be peace? In Israel, how do we cooperate together? How do we really try to establish a solution that is going to bring about peace? I mean, I've been involved in this situation for over 30 years. My life as, you know, as an advocate, I feel should be coming to an end, but it isn't. So I've been involved for 30 years from when I was initially on campus. I'm sure you also have been involved for many years, and other people who are more of the mature people in this audience. Will there ever be peace? And what can we effectively do to recognize both sides' right to exist, both sides' right to education, healthcare, everything else, but both sides to have a place to live? What do we do?
And the occupation.
Do you want me to respond or to ask for other questions?
I just came from Israel, and I would like to say that there is a movement actually amongst the youth. Basically, they are refusing to fight. That is the biggest movement going on. So I'm not sure. They're very brainwashed, and even the open-minded believe that it's a defensive army, okay? So I believe that the grassroots is to get into the schools and the education system, because once these people start to realize, they stop fighting. They don't want to fight when they start to have their minds opened.
Here, here.
Well, I can't help but say that your idea of peace is submission, which is generally the synonym for that is used in most Western speeches. I mean, anytime anything happens in the Middle East, a bunch of Western diplomats, Americans, Canadians, whoever, will go there and say, we want peace. And, you know, what they're really meaning is, we want you to submit, to bow down, and then there will be peace. Oppression is not peace. It's just a form of war that is a little more quiet, a little more, you know, acceptable. So to say that we want peace and at the same time unconditional support of Israel, there will never be peace until there's equality in who is getting aid, until we stop unconditional military aid to Israel so that war is no longer profitable. I mean, do you think that just on the basis of maybe 1,500 Palestinian women and children, that they're going to give up, what was it, $10 billion? $10 billion is well worth that cost. Let's keep up the war as long as we can. Let's keep murdering as long as we can, as long as it brings us our money in. And so to exemplify this Western ideal that we need peace at any cost, that the Palestinians have to bow down, we shouldn't be using the word peace. We should be using, you know, equality, egalitarianism, not just an end to the conflict, because an end to military conflict, the disarmament of Hamas, is the last thing that area needs.
Okay. Can I just quickly respond to your question you asked about the relationship between Ireland and Israel and all that?
And then what's happened in America, how
Right.
there has actually been some progress
You
in
see,
this world.
as far as the Good Friday Agreement was concerned in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, there would never been any progress made while Margaret Thatcher's dictum remained the law of the land. And her dictum was no negotiation with terrorists. And the 2 prime terrorists from the Provisional IRA was Martin McGuinness from Derry and Gerry Adams from Belfast, from West Belfast. So it's only after that the provisionals were brought into the negotiations and Sinn Féin was then accorded its rightful status as a legal political party that any kind of serious negotiations could take place, because, like it or not, the nationalist population in West Belfast and in Derry and in the south of the province were only represented by the Republicans, because they were the only group that were prepared to offer armed defence of Catholic areas which were being brutalised, burnt out and murdered by loyalist murder gangs. So the first condition has to be inclusiveness in negotiations. And the argument that the IRA doesn't accept the Westminster government and doesn't accept who still wants a united Ireland, that argument had to be overthrown. And even to this day, Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams refuse to take their seats in Westminster. They still refuse to do that. But they are, of course, now members of the power-sharing assembly. So when we come to Hamas, Hamas doesn't recognize the legal boundaries of Israel. Well, does anyone know what the charter of the Likud party is? And we have to get to know it, because our next prime minister in Israel will be from the Likud party. If you read the charter of the Likud party, it makes it clear that it exercises complete sovereignty over the occupied territories in perpetuity. It can give some relief to home rule, as it calls, that's an Irish expression, home rule to the Palestinians, but never sovereignty and never national determination. So Likud actually, under Netanyahu, does not respect or recognize the right of a Palestinian state. So, I mean, we hear a lot about Hamas refusing to recognize the borders of Israel. And I always wonder, well, which Israel? I mean, Israel in 1948, or Israel in 1967, or Israel in 1973. I mean, the borders are fluid, to put it politely. So I don't think that that should be a sticking point, that Hamas should be brought in. It should be a full party to these negotiations, just like the Provisional IRA, because there will be no way forward to peace. Your other question was about the efficacy of boycotts, and a good question, because besides the question, why Israel, why not? The other question is, well, boycotts are ineffective. They never work anyway. but sometimes they do work. Our experience in South Africa was once the boycotts really acquired momentum, and particularly after the US Congress implemented a trade sanctions against the South African regime, what we saw was a split develop between the apartheid government versus the white business corporate elite. And if you can remember, back then, even while the apartheid government was committing massacres in Soweto, as it had done in Sharpeville 20 years earlier, the corporate elite in South Africa were already having secret talks with Oliver Tambo of the African National Congress. The boycott forced a split between the political structure of oppression and the need for economic exploitation, to put it bluntly. And that split was the final end of apartheid. That's how it came down, in my humble opinion. And that was the power of boycotts, which did quite a bit to do that. Sorry.
Excuse me, can we just make sure we really exceeded the time, so maybe it can be our last question?
Sorry, and one right here, this one's been trying for a long time.
Did you want to let the lady go first?
I just have a very short question.
Sorry.
I went to grad school in Manitoba years ago, and I have always wondered why Canadians are not aware of how strong Zionism is in Manitoba and how effective the Aspers have been influencing Canadian-Israeli relations through the media.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
I didn't know that we could have adopted that phrase from Brett's home rule. I've always thought we should also use the German one, Lebensraum.
Lebensraum.
My question is this. I have some difficulty with your idea of boycotting the academic exchanges, because a couple of years ago there was a prof from Israel here who gave quite an interesting talk on his experience with trying to get a PhD thesis through a Israeli university about the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1947. The university he was at, he couldn't get anyone to what's the word?
Sponsor.
Yeah, I think he had to go to Tel Aviv to get it done. So, under your, I'm afraid that this law of unintended consequences may kick in, and people like that will be banned from coming to Canada.
That's a good question. The way I've tried to deal with that in the resolution I'm sponsoring to my own faculty association is to put under review any institutional agreements of partnerships and collaborations in a way which does not necessarily prejudice the movement of individual academics. I was thinking exactly about the point that you've just raised. I mean, there have been attempts by other organizations to put blanket academic boycotts on. Nobody from Israel can come, etc., etc. That seems to me to be senseless and counterproductive for the reasons that you've just given. But I think there is a point to be made in trying to discourage institutional agreements which serve to legitimize the Israeli state in ways which I personally am not willing to do right now. I take your point. I think there's a way around it. I think you can word such a resolution carefully. Are we finished? Yeah, Sabira.
Thank you so much for volunteering so much of your time for me. That was awesome. I learned so much from you.
I learned from you. Thanks a lot.